Alright, welcome to NDIS and the vet sector. Also I'm going to include here the higher education sector as in university. This is a short video I did at a recent conference as an overview on this topic, and I thought, well, there was a bit of interest in it further afield, so I'm going to put this together really quickly for you. It doesn't go for too long. I am mindful though that this is an opinion piece based on the facts available at the time. I am mindful that considering that the NDIS is still evolving, some of this information may not be necessarily applicable if viewed in context of those possible future changes. So let's get going. Righto, just to get everyone on the same page, I thought I'd just show you this quick video that I made not too long ago. We'll see how this goes. Alright, first thing to note that the information contained in the following slides was taken from the NDIS website, pages, resources and documents. The main one I want to focus on is this one here. This is the principles to determine the responsibilities of NDIS and other service systems, in particular mainstream services under several different categories like health systems, higher education, school systems. So the one I most focused on obviously was the higher education one, pages 14, 15. So these were developed under COAG, and this sets out basically what will be funded and what won't be funded when the NDIS integrates with these mainstream services. Also note up in the top right hand corner you'll see this statement here. This is pretty much the overarching guiding principle. Whenever there's a grey area, we always go back to this one. So just bear all that sort of stuff in mind. Plus there's all these other fact sheets. But these are sort of built from a lot of this stuff. Alright, let's continue. So specific to the vet sector and higher education, there is a clear definition around what will be covered by NDIS and what will not. So things that will be covered and things that won't be covered. So we've got all our yeses, all our no's. Although there's always been those areas of grey in the middle, though, there's always some exceptions to the rules, and this is what happens when you go to forums and discussion pieces and you talk about this. People will bring up examples to say, well, maybe that isn't the case. But let's have a quick look at what those yeses are versus the no's. So support to higher education, support to prepare for higher education is a line item under the NDIS schedule. Transport aids and equipment, so they're personal transport aids and equipment. You've got personal care on campus, that's a really important one that we'll talk about a bit later. And assistance with transport, which is still sort of being developed and not fully understood yet, with some high court cases and challenges around this assistance and how much the NDIS is going to fund and where it's going to fund it. Very much a regional context question, the assistance with transport, which for us regional guys is a constant issue. Now, what you have on the other side, what they won't fund, is stuff that we're already expected to fund in the vet and higher education sector. For example, transport for educational purposes, so we're talking excursions, that sort of stuff. Reasonable adjustments, that's always been there. Campus accessibility, so this is having your accessible toilets, your accessible everything else, your stairs, elevators and everything in consideration. So hopefully that's not anything new for anyone. Teacher learning and assistance, and I'm going to come back to that one in a minute, because this is where one of those conversations happened around who can provide what, which is a really good example. Access to educational resources, and obviously learning specific aids and equipment. So we're thinking JAWS, Zoom Reader, that sort of stuff for there. This teaching learning assistance one was interesting. So the example was given that an Auslan interpreter for a teaching class, for example, would be the responsibility of the vet sector, so the school or campus. But what about when you take into consideration that campus life is not all about the educational side of it, it's also that social side of it. So a deaf student comes into campus to learn something, but they also want to experience all that interaction from integrating with other people or external support services within the organisation. So we're talking lunch times where they're walking around and just dealing with other people. Who would provide that in that instance? Yes, probably if it was in their plan, then they might get to bring someone along and have them access an interpreter at lunchtime. Wouldn't it make more sense to just use the same interpreter that's already there, or the same suite of interpreters that are already there? That's a question that hasn't quite been answered, but then again, it's going to come down to one-on-one stuff as this NDIS stuff develops. This has been a really interesting area to consider, and there's been many different approaches from the various people I made contact with about this inquiry. Some organisations are not only registering as providers, some are actually doing so with the express reason to create new services or programs that will rely basically on the NDIS funded dollar coming into the organisation. So what you see here is you've got a whole bunch of line items that people are looking at within the scheme and saying, well, that's something that we already develop or something we already deliver. And not much of a stretch for us to actually deliver that under the scheme, as long as it is not part of a mainstream funding component. And I'll get to a really clear example of that in a minute. It's quite logical that they might want to do this. For example, a foundation course about getting ready, transition through to school and further education, that's a pathway course that's very similar. So it just might be how they set themselves up for that component. And I've also heard of at least one organisation in the vet sector that was actually going to become a support services or create a support service section within their sort of learner services department for that that private carer type role, not the teacher private role. But it gets a bit blurry. So the NDIS or NDIA, the managers of the scheme, don't really like that sort of approach. But there are several other areas to consider. One of the line items in here in particular is training for carers and parents. So this is related to the caring for a person with a disability. Now, this is really hot in the vet sector for under the allied health sort of sector and how they deliver that. If you have someone arrive at your campus with the money attached to them via this line item, what is the mechanism that allows you or for them to spend the money at your organisation if you're not a registered provider? Now, I say this because participants initially, or mostly, will come through the scheme as NDI managed, and if you're not a registered provider, you'll not be able to access any of the funds allocated to that person. But we do have partial self-managed or third-party managed or self-managed in total individuals. Not a great percentage of them, but they still may arrive, and you should still be able. So in that case, you wouldn't need to be a registered provider, but you'll still need to have a service agreement in place for these people. And in the future, as you look at the wording under the quality framework, the national quality framework that's due to come in at some stage, you would also need to have a specifically worded code of conduct when dealing with anyone that's using that money. So this question, I don't think is going to necessarily go away really quickly, and different areas and different regions are going to have a really different approach to this. And you think about example, New South Wales, as a one TAFE, I'd imagine they'll make a blanket decision, so there won't be like one organisation down one end of the street is different from another as far as a TAFE organisation goes. So I've included this slide here. This is really about one of the things that was highlighted to me in my conversations around the place as I rang people up and said, what's going on for those organisations already in the NDIS environment. So what's really happening there that's affecting you the most? And one of the ones that come back was this one, the personal care on campus guys. So a student with a disability is turning up to class, and they've actually got a personal carer that's not a support or tutor aid with them. And it was about how do they actually manage those people as far as their policies and procedures go. Yeah, and look, there's a little bit of work going on around this through some small projects, and one of which I've highlighted here with Darlene from ADSET, NDIS Tasmania, which is, they're all good and they're all small. And the thing that I want to point out is they'll have a lot of relevance for a lot of other mainstream services as the scheme continues to roll out, because they're going to be faced with the same issues, but there's also a chance that they may be already working within this as well. So there's lessons to be learnt from some of these other organisations that aren't educational based. And I'm thinking health system as a major one. So it's about keeping your eyes and ears open around this one. And again, it might be really contextualised to how your local organisations operate. Now, one major consideration is the perception of people with disability receiving more assistance to engage with mainstream services. Then surely we should see the rise in the number of people enrolling in disability courses. So when more people get transport aids and equipment for transport, we get more people supported to prepare for higher education. And I'll get to some of those how that's going to happen shortly. And the assistance with transport to get to the educational facilities. The expectation is that we're going to get more people engaging with the education sector and all the other mainstream services, hopefully. But we must remember that this is not necessarily happening as you speak to those guys in the rollout areas now. But that's because the scheme's still very new. It's in its infancy. And this is really born out of the quarterly NDIS market reports that show funding in the core areas for education and employment still remain very low compared to all the other core scheme funded areas. So it's not necessarily that flow on just yet, but I would expect that to change, and there should be an increase. So how prepared are we for those service? Are we to service those new individuals? And I'm talking here around those direct learner services support areas, but also how prepared are we with our universal design learning stuff? So universal access of documentation. So is all our videos captioned? Do we have different formats available for people to access content? These are all considerations that around having more people with disability access your service. One other area to point out is not about how prepared we are, but there's a flip side of concern around this, especially in the vet sector. So it's actually quite possible that some specifically targeted, for example, intellectual disability students coming out of school, may actually be steered away from the mainstream service, and this is due to a thing called the School Leaver Employment Scheme. Well, that's what they're saying anyway, or School Leaver Employment Supports, sorry, I'll get it right. SLES, or SLES is the short version of it. So let's talk about SLES for a minute. So SLES is a set of line items packaged together, and it targets school leavers who are part of the scheme or eligible for the scheme, but are not yet necessarily ready to enter any other mainstream services in the areas of pathways, towards further education or employment. Integral to this package working are the teachers of where the kids are coming from, who have the responsibility of administering what's called a functioning capacity assessment, which tells the local area coordinator as to whether this individual is eligible to access the SLES or not. So there's a lot of education going on there at the moment, and you can see on the slide I've put a little note in there that I've taken out of the correspondence from NDIA around these things called regional employment champions, and I'm still finding my way through that process of who they are and what they're doing. And so are the schools for that matter, and there might be some lessons to be learnt from that process for us in the further educational sector. But for a lot of the vet sector providers of foundation courses, there's a concern that if the person with disability arrives at a planning meeting with an eligible functioning capacity assessment attached to them, The easy option for the local area coordinator is to refer them straight to a SLES provider. Now, this obviously raises questions for the TAFEs or local vets as to, should I become a SLES provider, considering that most of the work that they do in those foundation courses are exactly the same or very similar. Again, this is, I keep using the word contextualise or localise. It really does become a question depending on where you're at. So this is a market-based question which dominates the functionality of the NDIS itself. So I imagine a city provider approach to this may be very different to a regional provider. Yeah, so I told you this was a pretty quick presentation, and this is my final slide. And this is a sign I pass nearly every day on my journey to work for over 10 years, and I hadn't really noticed it until the arrival of the NDIS. I'm still not sure how I react to this, or how I feel about this, or what emotions and thoughts this sign provokes to me when you consider NDIS is really about integrating disability as just the normality of society caters for. Yeah, and I'll let you look at the sign, have a think about it, and come up with your own idea of that. One thing I'd like to say in closing is this: no matter how the NDIS develops, we just need to focus on the good work that we're already doing, and making our communities more inclusive and accessible. The universal design here is a critical component, and a commitment from all organisations to do better in this area is the passion that we all need to realise. Look, thanks very much for that. I'm going to get out of your hairs. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Mark Cotty.